7 million prime age men have walked away from the workforce, and society is now paying the price in ways it never imagined. We have spent years watching this slow burn happen right in front of us, where men, especially those in their prime working years, started stepping back from traditional jobs and the whole system that told them they were disposable in the first place. Now the consequences are rolling in hard with labor shortages in trades that keep infrastructure running, factories humming, and national security solid. Companies are scrambling, wages for skilled male labor are climbing fast, and everyone from economists to talk show hosts is starting to sound the alarm, but most of them still miss the real story. Stick with this all the way through because by the end, you will see exactly why this shift is not some temporary blip. It is a fundamental change in how men are choosing to live and what that means for the rest of society that pushed them there in the first place. If you're enjoying these angry guy videos and want to show some support, you can buy me a Red Bull with a one-time gift or set up a monthly pledge using the link in the description. It helps keep the raw conversations going without any corporate filter. Men are not showing up for work the way they used to. And the cost of that male labor, especially in blue collar fields, is skyrocketing because demand is high and the supply of willing, skilled hands has dried up in a big way. Think about it for a second. These are the jobs that build things, fix things, and keep the country moving. Yet fewer and fewer young men are stepping into them, while the older guys who know the trades are retiring and taking their expertise with them. Statistics keep showing this trend where labor force participation for prime age men has been sliding for decades. And now we are looking at millions who are neither working nor looking for traditional employment. It is not laziness. In the simple sense, it is a response to years of being told that their natural strengths, their drive, and their way of operating in the world were problems that needed fixing or erasing altogether. Society spent a long time demonizing men, calling everyday male behavior toxic, and pushing narratives that made traditional male roles seem outdated or harmful. Men heard that message loud and clear. Instead of fighting it or complaining endlessly, they did what they have always done when the path gets blocked, they found another way. They walked away and discovered peace and solitude and alternative ways to make a living that do not involve grinding in environments that no longer value them. You see guys turning to the gig economy, driving for delivery apps, handling packages, or running their own small operations online. Some dive into day trading crypto or building digital businesses from home where they set their own hours and answer to no one. They live below their means, keep expenses low, and focus on what actually brings them satisfaction instead of chasing status or approval from a system that turned on them. Video games, relaxing at home, and avoiding the constant pressure of dating and relationships that feel stacked against them have become part of that new equilibrium. It looks like checking out from the outside, but for many, it is reclaiming control and finding a version of freedom that the old 9 to 5 never delivered, especially when the rewards kept shrinking while the risks and disrespect stayed high. Now the panic is setting in because those empty roles in trades and manufacturing cannot be filled overnight. Infrastructure projects get delayed, costs climb, and companies pass those increases on to consumers. National security feels the pinch too when skilled workers for critical manufacturing are in short supply. This is not some abstract economic graph. It is real shortages hitting supply chains and raising prices on everything from homes to vehicles to repairs. The demand for these skilled men has created a situation where their labor commands more money, but the pipeline of new talent is not there because generations of boys were steered away from hands on work toward college degrees that often lead to debt and jobs that AI is now threatening anyway. Blue collar paths that used to offer solid pay stability and pride got painted as lesser options, while everyone pushed the idea that everyone must go to university. That mismatch is coming home to roost, and the bill is higher than anyone wants to admit. Women who spent decades in the workforce are facing their own reckoning. Many are getting laid off as artificial intelligence handles tasks that once required office staff. Burnout from jobs that never delivered the promised fulfillment has left them with debt, rising expenses, and a desire for something different. Suddenly, the same voices that championed total independence are talking about finding a provider who can cover the bills and allow a softer life at home. They want the benefits of the old arrangement without the responsibilities that came with it, and without acknowledging how the push to sideline men contributed to this spot. Men, on the other hand, have largely checked out of the dating and marriage market. They listened when they were told to step back and leave women alone. They built lives that do not revolve around chasing relationships that feel one-sided or risky in a legal and cultural environment that often treats them as the disposable party. The result is women showing up in droves at dating events while men stay scarce because the peace they found in their own space beats the alternative. This is the sobering part that a lot of people do not want to face. Society pushed men out through constant criticism policies that favored other groups and a culture that celebrated male failure as some kind of progress. Now that the labor shortages are biting and women are feeling the economic pressure, the call goes out for men to come back and fix things. But men are not rushing to answer because they remember how it went last time. They found solitude and self reliance, and many are not interested in returning to a setup that demands everything while offering diminishing returns. It is not hatred or bitterness for most of them, it is clarity. They, they see the game for what it is, and they chose a different table. The loneliness narrative gets flipped around too. While some talk about a male loneliness epidemic, the reality on the ground shows many men content in their independence. It is often the other side dealing with the fallout of economic instability and unmet expectations around partnership and support. Look at how this plays out in everyday terms. Construction sites that used to have steady crews now struggle to find reliable workers. Manufacturing plants lose contracts because they cannot scale production. Repair services for homes and vehicles take longer and cost more because the expertise is concentrated in fewer hands. This scarcity drives up wages for the men who stayed in those fields, which is fair given the value they bring, but it also highlights how dependent the economy remains on that traditional male labor. Governments and companies notice the gap and start floating ideas about training programs or incentives, yet they rarely address the cultural roots that led so many to opt out. Boys in school get less emphasis on physical skills and trades. Media and education frame male ambition as suspect. The message over years was clear enough that men internalized it and built lives accordingly. The gig economy became a lifeline for many. Delivering packages or food gives flexibility and immediate pay without the office politics or long term commitments that feel draining. Crypto and online ventures offer upside potential for those willing to learn and take calculated risks. Staying home and managing expenses tightly means more time for hobbies, rest, and personal projects. It is a form of quiet rebellion that does not require marches or manifestos, just consistent daily choices that add up to independence. Society calls it dropping out, but from the inside, it feels like opting into something better suited to the current reality. Men are not disappearing, they are reallocating their energy where it actually pays off for them. Women facing higher rents, food costs, and inflation after years in jobs that left them broke are starting to voice frustration. Some openly talk about wanting a partner who can provide stability so they can step back from the grind. The irony lands heavy because the independence that was sold as empowerment now looks like a heavy load when the safety net of shared responsibilities is gone. Feminism delivered choices and opportunities, but it also dismantled expectations around male provision without replacing them with sustainable alternatives. When the state or the job market cannot fill that gap, the default plan B of turning back to men falls flat because those men have moved on. Dating events with hundreds of women and almost no men tell the story without needing statistics. The competition for quality partners has intensified, and the old scripts no longer work. Men walked away without fanfare. They did not stage protests or demand apologies. They simply found peace and solitude and alternative paths that let them breathe. No more navigating minefields of potential accusations or expectations that shifted with every cultural wave. No more pouring energy into relationships where the risks outweighed the rewards under current laws and social norms. That solitude brought clarity and calm for many. They rebuilt their days around what matters to them personally, whether that is skill building, leisure, or low stress income streams. The world outside may label it problematic, but the men living it often describe a level of contentment they never had before. This is the wake up call. Actions have consequences, and the consequence of telling half the population they are the problem is that they eventually stop volunteering to carry the load. The labor market tightness in male dominated fields is not going away soon. Retirements in trades continue while younger cohorts steer clear. Wages rise to attract talent, but that only works up to a point when the deeper cultural and educational pipelines remain broken. Infrastructure bills and manufacturing, reshoring sound good on paper until you realize there are not enough hands to do the actual building. National security conversations start including workforce readiness because you cannot defend or innovate without people who can weld code machines or maintain equipment. This is raw economics meeting human choices. Men are choosing differently, and the system that relied on their previous patterns is feeling the strain. It is worth sitting with the scale of this. Millions of prime age men off the traditional grid changes everything from GDP projections to family formation to community stability. The stories of companies losing millions in potential revenue because they cannot hire enough skilled people are real. The frustration of executives who see the demand but cannot find the supply highlights a disconnect that training programs alone will not fix. You have to address why so many men looked at the deal on offer and said no thanks. The demonization, the shifting rules, the lack of respect for male nature all played a part. Men adapted by withdrawing consent from the old contract. Women who once pushed hard for career first lifestyles are confronting the limits when those careers stall or fail to provide the life they envisioned. Debt from education and living expenses piles up while inflation eats into purchasing power. The desire for children and a softer domestic role resurfaces for many, yet the pool of willing, committed men has shrunk. The same independence that was celebrated now leaves them carrying full financial loads without the partnership buffer. Dating markets reflect this imbalance, with events full on one side and empty on the other. The call for men to step up as providers rings hollow when those men remember being told they were not needed or were actively harmful. And trust, once broken, takes more than words to rebuild, and many men are not interested in trying. This dynamic creates a feedback loop. Fewer marriages and births mean smaller future workforces. Economic pressures on women increase calls for support that men are less inclined to give under the old terms. Society panics about male dropout rates while still framing the issue in ways that avoid accountability for the cultural push that encouraged it. The truth is straightforward. Men found alternatives that work for them, and they are sticking with what brings peace. The cost of male labor rises because scarcity always does that. Infrastructure and industry feel the pinch because you cannot run a modern economy without the builders and maintainers. The gig routes and online hustles keep men afloat without the soul crushing aspects of mismatched corporate cultures. Living lean means freedom from debt traps and status chasing. Video games and hobbies fill time in ways that feel restorative rather than obligatory. Avoiding the dating grind removes a major source of stress and financial risk. This is not escapism for everyone involved, it is recalibration. Men assessed the environment and chose paths that maximize their autonomy and satisfaction. Society that once relied on their sacrifice and drive now has to adjust to their absence from those roles. The wake up is sobering because reversing it requires more than incentives. It requires a fundamental shift in how men are viewed and valued. Blue collar wages climbing is one visible sign. Companies competing for the remaining skilled workers drive up pay and benefits. That is market reality. Yet the broader shortage persists because the cultural narrative against those jobs lingers. Parents and counselors still push college for everyone, even when outcomes show debt and underemployment for many. Trades get dismissed as dirty or dead end despite the solid earnings and tangible results. Young men see that mismatch and opt for flexibility elsewhere. The result is a labor market where certain skills command premiums while overall male participation lags. This is not sustainable long term without addressing the reasons men step back. Women dealing with layoffs and burnout are vocal about wanting providers again. The soft life appeal grows when the independent grind proves exhausting and expensive. Yet the men they seek are busy with their own peace and not lining up to take on full financial responsibility in a culture that still carries suspicion toward traditional roles. The betrayal of trusting the state or the system over partnership comes back around when that system proves unreliable. Women are left competing for fewer quality men, while men enjoy the solitude that brings clarity. It is a hard reality, but one that stems directly from choices made over decades. The national conversation around male labor force dropout often misses the piece many have found. They are not all suffering in isolation. Many are content with lower stress lives that align with their interests. The real struggle shows up more on the side facing economic pressures without the traditional support structures. This flips the loneliness script in ways that make people uncomfortable, but the data and anecdotes line up with men opting out by choice and finding satisfaction there. Society needs to grapple with that instead of pathologizing male independence. Infrastructure risks grow when skilled trades cannot meet demand. Projects delay, costs balloon, and quality suffers. Manufacturing for defense and consumer goods hits bottlenecks. These are concrete outcomes of millions stepping back. The skyrocketing cost of male labor reflects that scarcity and forces a reevaluation of how those skills are compensated and respected. Yet respect was part of what was stripped away earlier, and rebuilding it will take consistent effort over time. Men are not coming back just because someone rings an alarm bell. They have tasted a different way, and many prefer it. This is the straightforward truth. Men listened to the message that they should go away, and they did. They built peace and solitude and alternative economies. Now, the bill for that shift is coming due in labor markets and social dynamics. Women facing their own challenges are discovering the limits of going it alone in a high cost world. The panic from companies and commentators shows the dependency that was taken for granted. The sobering wake up is that actions have lasting consequences, and the consequences here are reshaping society in real time. Men are not rushing to rescue the old setup. They are living on their terms, and that choice is forcing everyone else to adapt. The trades gap widens with retirements and few replacements. Wages rise to attract talent, but the deeper pipeline issue remains. Education systems that devalued hands on learning contributed heavily. Cultural attitudes that framed male spaces and interests as problematic pushed many away. The gig economy absorbed some of that energy with flexible work that fits new priorities. Online businesses and digital skills let men control their destiny without gatekeepers. This shift is not reversible by simple policy tweaks. It requires honest reckoning with why so many men chose to walk. Women burned out from careers that promised everything but delivered debt and exhaustion are rethinking priorities. The desire for providers and stay at home options reveals the appeal of shared loads when solo becomes unsustainable. Yet the men available for that role are fewer and wiser to the risks. Dating imbalances grow more pronounced as events highlight the scarcity of engaged men. The peace men found in solitude stands in contrast to the struggles on the other side. This is not about blame. It is about observing cause and effect in a system that ignored half the population's response. Labor costs in male heavy fields climb because demand exceeds supply. Companies feel it in profits and timelines. Consumers see it in prices. National priorities around infrastructure and security face real constraints. The men who remain in those roles command better compensation, which is natural, but the overall shortage signals deeper cultural changes. Men who walked away are not coming back en masse without fundamental shifts in respect and incentives that match their lived experience. The solitude they chose brought clarity and calm that the old path often lacked. This reality demands a truthful look at how we got here. Decades of messaging that diminished male value led to withdrawal. Men adapted by finding peace and self reliance. Society now confronts the whole left behind. The wake up call is that you cannot push people out and expect them to return on command when their new path works better for them. Women navigating economic pressures are learning similar lessons about independence limits. The conversation needs to move past surface fixes to root causes if any balance is to be restored. For now, men continue on their chosen course and the consequences ripple outward. The skilled trade shortage is not just numbers on a report, it is delayed projects, higher costs, and strained systems. Young men avoiding those paths because of stigma and steering toward other options left a gap that is hard to close quickly. Wages increasing for those in the field is one market correction, but it does not solve the participation drop among prime age men. The broader economy feels the impact in productivity and growth potential. This is the raw outcome of cultural choices meeting economic reality. Men found alternatives that suit them, and society is adjusting whether it wants to or not. Women seeking providers after years of independence messaging face a market where men are less available and less inclined. The soft life appeals when the alternative is continued grind with rising costs. Yet trust and willingness on the male side have eroded. Solitude brought men peace they were not finding in traditional setups. That peace is not easily traded away. The imbalance in dating and partnership reflects this new equilibrium. It is a sobering picture of how incentives and respect shape behavior over time. Infrastructure and manufacturing depend on male labor in key ways. The scarcity drives up costs and delays. Companies panic as roles stay open. The national security angle adds urgency when critical skills are in short supply. This is not temporary. It stems from long term trends in participation and cultural attitudes. Men who walked away built lives around flexibility and self direction. They are not looking back with regret. The system that relied on their previous engagement must now face the new reality they created by opting out. The truth lands heavy but clear. Men listened and walked. They found peace. Society is feeling the cost. Labor shortages, wage pressures, and social shifts all trace back to that choice. Women confronting their own challenges see the other side of independence. The wake up is here, and it requires honest acknowledgement of what drove the change. Men are not returning to fix it on the old terms. They are living differently, and that difference is reshaping everything around them. This pattern continues as more men discover the benefits of their chosen paths. Gig work, online ventures, and lean living provide autonomy that traditional jobs often stripped away. The peace and solitude counters the stress of environments that felt hostile or unappreciative. Wages climbing for remaining skilled men reward those who stayed, but the overall drop in participation creates systemic strain. Education and culture need reevaluation if the pipeline is to improve. For now, the consequences are here, and men are content with their decisions. Women dealing with debt burnout and inflation pressures voice desires for support that highlight the challenges of solo economic life. The provider role that was once taken for granted now faces resistance from men who built self sufficient lives. Dating events expose the imbalance with women in abundance and men choosing other priorities. The solitude men embraced brought them clarity and calm that many are unwilling to trade. This is the straightforward dynamic playing out in real time. Society pushed, and men responded by walking away. The results are visible in labor markets and personal choices. The labor cost increase in male dominated fields is a direct result of scarcity. Demand for tradesmen outstrips supply, leading to higher pay and still unfilled roles. Infrastructure projects feel the delay. Manufacturing output faces limits. This is the economic face of a cultural shift. Men who opted for alternative paths found satisfaction that outweighs the pull of traditional work. Their peace is real, and it is not disappearing because of external pressure. The sobering truth is that rebuilding participation requires more than money. It requires respect and a change in how men are treated and valued. This is the reality we are living. Men walked away, found peace, and left a hole that society is scrambling to fill. The costs are rising, the imbalances are clear, and the wake up call is loud for those willing to hear it. The choices were made over years, and the consequences are arriving now. Men are not going back to the old deal. They are living on terms that work for them, and that shift is forcing adaptation across the board. It is raw, it is truthful, and it is the new baseline. The education system that shaped the last couple generations played a bigger role in this shift than most folks want to admit, because from early on, boys were funneled into classrooms that prioritized sitting still and following rules over building things with their hands or solving problems the way their instincts told them to. And that created a disconnect that carried straight into adulthood, where trades got treated like backup plans instead of solid, respectable paths that could lead to real stability and pride in a job well done. Counselors and teachers pushed college degrees for everyone as the golden ticket, even when the numbers showed that plenty of those degrees left graduates buried in debt with jobs that paid less than a skilled electrician or plumber could pull in after a few years of apprenticeship. And the cultural messaging layered on top made anything blue collar seem like it was beneath ambition or somehow tied to outdated ideas about masculinity that society had decided needed correcting. Boys who naturally gravitated toward mechanical work or physical problem solving got redirected into abstract subjects that did not light the same fire. And by the time they hit their late teens, the pipeline into apprenticeships had thinned out, leaving the trades reliant on the same aging workforce that was already heading toward retirement without enough fresh blood coming in to keep things running smoothly. This was not some accident. It was the result of policies and attitudes that devalued practical skills in favor of a one size fits all model that ignored how a lot of young men learn best through doing and seeing immediate results from their efforts. And now we are living with the fallout where entire sectors cannot find the talent they need because the foundational encouragement that used to exist has been stripped away over decades of well meaning but misguided reforms. Think about the way family courts and legal frameworks stack the deck in ways that made traditional commitments feel like walking into a rigged game for men, and that reality seeped into the collective awareness, making the idea of marriage or even long term relationships look like a high risk move, where one wrong turn could lead to losing half your assets or facing restrictions on seeing your own kids, while the system often sided with the other party regardless of the details. Men watched friends and relatives go through divorces that left them financially ruined and emotionally drained, and they internalized the lesson that putting everything on the line for a partnership that could dissolve at any moment with severe consequences was not the smart play, especially when the cultural conversation kept emphasizing male fault in relationship breakdowns without balancing out the responsibilities on both sides. This created a quiet but powerful hesitation that grew stronger with each high profile story or statistic about unfair settlements and child support orders that did not reflect actual involvement or ability to pay. And it pushed men toward protecting their own futures by staying independent rather than signing up for arrangements that felt one sided from the start. The peace they found in solitude started to look a lot more appealing when compared to the potential chaos of entering a system that treated their contributions as expected, but their vulnerabilities as irrelevant. And that choice to step back was not about avoiding responsibility, it was about refusing to volunteer for a setup that had proven unreliable for too many. Housing markets feel this shift in ways that compound the pressure because fewer men committing to family formation means less demand for larger homes in suburban areas. And that slows construction in certain segments while at the same time, the labor shortages in building trades drive up the cost of what does get built, making entry level homes even harder to afford for the people who still want them. Builders struggle to find enough crews to meet timelines, and the higher wages they pay to attract the remaining skilled workers get passed straight to buyers, inflating prices further and creating a cycle where young couples or individuals face barriers that previous generations did not have to navigate at the same scale. This ripples into rental markets too, where property owners deal with higher maintenance costs due to scarce repair talent, and those expenses get built into monthly rents, leaving everyone paying more for less stability in their living situations. The sobering part is that these economic pressures hit hardest on the very groups that once counted on male labor and partnership to balance the load, yet the men who opted out are living lean and avoiding the debt traps that come with chasing bigger houses or family sized properties, so they sidestep the crunch while the system that relied on their participation scrambles to adjust. Inflation gets a quiet boost from all this because when key sectors like manufacturing and infrastructure cannot scale efficiently due to workforce gaps, the supply of goods and services tightens and prices climb across the board from groceries to vehicles to everyday repairs that now take longer and cost more than they should. Companies pass those increased labor expenses on to consumers without much choice, and the overall productivity dip from unfilled roles slows economic growth, making the money people earn buy less over time, even as wages in certain fields rise to compensate for the scarcity. This creates a strange imbalance where skilled men who stayed in trades see their paychecks grow, but the broader population deals with higher costs of living that stem directly from the same labor shortages, and the men who walked away into gig work or digital ventures often keep their expenses low enough to weather it without feeling the same pinch. It is a raw reminder that the decisions made in the name of social progress have tangible downstream effects that no amount of policy speeches can wave away. And the people sounding alarms now are starting to realize that the old model depended on men showing up and carrying the weight without complaint, which is exactly what stopped happening once the complaints turned into systemic disrespect. Governments have tried throwing money at the problem with training programs and incentives aimed at pulling men back into traditional jobs. But those efforts keep falling short because they address the symptoms without touching the deeper reasons why so many checked out in the first place. And the messaging from official channels still carries echoes of the same attitudes that drove the withdrawal by framing men as the ones who need fixing rather than acknowledging the cultural environment that made opting out feel like the rational move. Programs get announced with fanfare about apprenticeships and scholarships for trades, yet the enrollment numbers stay low among younger cohorts who have already absorbed years of signals that those paths are not valued or respected in the wider society, and the bureaucratic hurdles, plus the lingering stigma, make the whole process feel like more trouble than it is worth when alternative income streams offer immediate flexibility without the oversight. This half hearted approach only highlights the disconnect between the people in charge and the realities on the ground where men have built lives that give them control. And they are not eager to hand that back for promises that have proven empty before. The demographic picture down the road looks stark because when men step back from marriage and fatherhood at these rates, the birth rates keep dropping, and that means smaller future generations entering the workforce, which compounds the labor shortages and strains social safety nets that were built assuming steady population growth and tax contributions from stable family units. Communities age faster, schools shrink in size, and the economic engine that relies on young workers to support retirees starts sputtering as the numbers simply do not add up anymore. And this is not some distant forecast, it is already showing up in population data from multiple countries that followed similar cultural paths towards sidelining male roles. The peace men found in their solitude includes a level of freedom from those traditional pressures that once tied their identities to providing for families. And while some might see that as a loss, the men living it often describe it as liberation from a cycle that demanded everything without guaranteeing fairness or appreciation in return. Society that once celebrated expanding choices for one group now faces the unintended contraction in overall family formation, and the long term costs of that are going to be paid by everyone through slower growth and heavier burdens on those who remain in the system. Women navigating the modern dating scene encounter a competition that feels more intense than anything previous generations dealt with because the pool of men actively looking for commitment has shrunk, and the ones who are still open to it often bring higher standards shaped by their independence and the lessons learned from watching the previous dynamics play out. Events that once drew balanced crowds now fill with hundreds of women and a handful of men, creating an atmosphere where the scarcity drives up expectations on both sides, but leaves many feeling frustrated when connections do not form as easily as they hoped. And the same voices that once pushed for women to prioritize careers and self reliance are now quietly acknowledging that the independence they championed left gaps that a partner used to fill without much fanfare. This is not about assigning fault, it is about observing how the pieces fit together. When one side walks away and the other side finds itself adjusting to a new reality where the old scripts no longer guarantee results, And the desperation that creeps in for some stems from economic pressures that make solo living more challenging as costs rise and job security wavers in fields hit by automation. Men who built their days around gig deliveries or online businesses discovered a rhythm that aligns with their energy levels instead of fighting against corporate schedules that felt draining and pointless. And that adjustment brought a clarity about what actually matters in daily life without the constant need to perform for approval from bosses or partners who might shift the goalposts at any moment. The freedom to set their own priorities, whether that means more time for physical fitness, creative pursuits, or simply unwinding without guilt, has proven restorative in ways that the old grind rarely delivered, and it reinforced the decision to stay out of environments that treated their presence as both essential and suspect at the same time. This internal shift is what makes the whole phenomenon so durable, because once someone experiences genuine autonomy after years of feeling boxed in by expectations, it becomes hard to imagine going back to the previous setup no matter how loudly the alarms get sounded from podiums or media outlets. The raw truth is that men adapted to the hand they were dealt, and in doing so, they uncovered strengths and satisfactions that the traditional path had obscured under layers of obligation and criticism. The AI wave hitting office based roles has accelerated the reckoning for many women who spent years climbing ladders only to see entire departments automated away, leaving them with skills that suddenly carry less market value and debt loads that do not vanish when the paycheck does. And this forces a conversation about what comes next when the promised career fulfillment turns out to be more fragile than advertised. The desire for a softer life that includes partnership and shared responsibilities resurfaces strongly in these moments. Yet the men who could fill that role have already invested in their own self contained worlds, and they approach any potential reconnection with caution, born from past experiences and the cultural baggage that still lingers. It creates a tension where calls for men to step up as providers meet a wall of men who have learned that providing without mutual respect or legal protections often leads to one sided outcomes, and the peace they cherish in their current arrangements wins out over the uncertainty of re entering the fray. Long term economic modeling keeps showing that sustained low male labor participation drags on growth projections and widens gaps in sectors that underpin everything from energy production to technology hardware. And the experts issuing reports sound increasingly urgent because the trends do not reverse themselves without addressing the human element at the core, which is the loss of trust and the gain in personal sovereignty that men have secured for themselves. Infrastructure bills get passed with big numbers attached, but the actual work stalls when crews cannot be assembled quickly enough, and that delay cascades into higher taxpayer costs and slower modernization of everything from roads to power grids to ports that handle global trade. The sobering wake up here is that you cannot legislate or subsidize your way out of a cultural withdrawal this deep, because the men who left did so after weighing the options and finding better ones on their own terms, and any serious attempt to bring them back would require rewriting the social contract in ways that restore the balance of respect and reciprocity that got lost along the way. Communities that once thrived on stable male employment see shifts in local economies where small businesses tied to trades struggle with supply issues and customers face longer waits for services that used to be routine. And this ripples into everything from home values to school funding as population dynamics change with fewer families forming in those areas. The men who opted for solitude and lean living often contribute in quieter ways through gig work or digital commerce that keeps money circulating, but on their schedule and without the overhead of large scale employers. So the overall system adapts unevenly, with some sectors contracting while others find new footholds in the flexibility that men embraced. This is the kind of transformation that does not make for neat headlines, but it is reshaping daily life in subtle yet profound ways that become obvious once you start connecting the dots between workforce participation, education steering, and the legal cultural environment that encourage men to protect their own peace above all else. The competitive reality for women in finding quality partners has evolved into something that demands more self reflection and adjustment than the independence narrative prepared them for, because the men who remain available often prioritize their own well being and boundaries after years of navigating a landscape that felt stacked against them. And that means relationships now require demonstrating mutual value rather than assuming traditional roles will automatically fall into place. Dating apps and events highlight the imbalance with profiles and attendance skewed heavily one way. And the conversations that do happen carry an undercurrent of caution from the male side that stems from real world observations rather than abstract fears, making the process slower and more deliberate than it was in eras when commitment felt like a safer bet. The peace men discovered in their solitude acts as a natural filter, allowing them to engage only when it truly aligns with their standards. And that selectivity, while frustrating for some, on the other side, actually raises the bar for what healthy partnerships could look like if both sides approach them with clearer eyes and fewer illusions about what each brings to the table. Economic forecasts that factor in these trends paint a picture of slower overall expansion unless the underlying drivers of male disengagement get confronted honestly, and the raw data on labor force participation continues to underscore that prime age men are not returning at the rates needed to sustain previous growth patterns without major cultural course corrections that go beyond surface level job fairs or tax credits. The men who have built alternative income streams through deliveries, crypto ventures, or home based operations report levels of satisfaction that challenge the assumption that traditional employment is the only path to fulfillment, and that mindset shift is what gives their choices staying power. Because once autonomy becomes the baseline, it is difficult to trade for structures that previously felt confining or risky. This is the authoritative bottom line that society keeps circling around, but rarely states plainly the withdrawal was a logical response to the conditions presented, and the peace that resulted is not a phase. It is a new equilibrium that forces everyone else to adapt their expectations and strategies accordingly. Ripple effects extend into healthcare and social services, where fewer stable family units mean different patterns of demand for support systems that were designed around two parent households sharing loads, and the aging population combined with lower birth rates strains resources in ways that policymakers are only beginning to quantify, while the men who stepped back often manage their own health and wellness on terms that keep them out of certain dependency cycles, leaving the burden distributed unevenly across the remaining participants. The straightforward truth is that every choice has trade offs, and the trade off for the peace men found is a society that must learn to function with a different distribution of labor and commitment, which includes higher costs in some areas and innovation in others, as people adjust to the new normal without the automatic male buy-in that once kept things humming along. Education reforms that finally start acknowledging the need for more hands on learning and trade pathways come too late for the cohorts already shaped by the previous system, and the lag time between policy change and workforce entry means the shortages will persist for years, even if attitudes shift dramatically today, because the boys who needed encouragement in middle school are now adults who have already charted their own courses away from the traditional tracks. This delay is what makes the situation feel so pressing for industries that cannot wait a decade for the pipeline to refill. And it underscores the importance of honest conversations about what went wrong in steering generations away from paths that offered tangible rewards and respect for skilled work. The men who walked away did not do so lightly. They evaluated the landscape and chose the route that preserved their dignity and autonomy, and that decision making process is what keeps them grounded in their current lives, despite external calls for them to rejoin the fray on the old terms. Women who find themselves in positions of economic uncertainty after career paths narrow due to technological changes often express a renewed appreciation for partnerships that share the load. Yet the reality they encounter is one where potential partners have grown comfortable with self reliance and are selective about re entering arrangements that could upend the balance they have achieved. And this mismatch creates a dynamic where patience and demonstration of compatibility become essential rather than assumed, which is a departure from earlier eras when roles felt more preset. The sobering aspect is how quickly the narrative can pivot when personal circumstances change. But the men who have tasted genuine freedom are not quick to forget the lessons that led them there, and their caution serves as a natural safeguard against repeating patterns that proved unsustainable. This back and forth is part of the larger adjustment period where society learns to navigate the consequences of decades of pushing one group toward the margins and then wondering why the margins became preferable. The global context mirrors some of these patterns in other developed nations, where similar cultural shifts occurred, leading to parallel labor shortages and demographic challenges that suggest the issue is not isolated to one country, but tied to broader trends in how modern societies value and incentivize male participation. And the raw data crossing borders shows that wherever the demonization of traditional male strengths took hold, the response from men was consistent withdrawal into spaces that offered control and peace instead of conflict and diminishing returns. This international angle adds weight to the domestic conversation because it shows the phenomenon is not a fluke or temporary backlash, but a predictable outcome of certain ideological and policy directions that prioritized other goals without fully accounting for the human response on the male side. Men adapted universally by finding alternative ways to thrive, and that collective movement has created a new baseline that economies around the world are now forced to reckon with in their planning and projections. Local economies and manufacturing hubs feel the pinch most acutely when skilled positions stay vacant for months at a time, leading to reduced output and lost contracts that affect suppliers and service providers in concentric circles of impact that eventually touch consumers through higher prices and limited availability of goods that once flowed steadily from those facilities. The men who chose gig work or entrepreneurial routes often fill gaps in the service sector with flexible availability that keeps some wheels turning, but it does not replace the specialized knowledge required for heavy industry or precision trades. And that distinction is what keeps the pressure on companies to compete aggressively for the remaining talent while the broader participation numbers lag. The authoritative view from the barstool perspective is that this is not reversible overnight because the peace men discovered has roots in real experiences. And until those experiences are addressed at the cultural level, the choices will stick and the adaptations will continue to reshape everything from daily costs to long term planning. The conversation around these changes needs to stay grounded in observable realities rather than wishful thinking about quick fixes, because the men who walked away did so after careful consideration, and the solitude they embraced brought a level of self knowledge that makes them less susceptible to external pressure or guilt trips about societal needs. They built lives that work for them, and in doing so, they expose the fragility of systems that took their contributions for granted. And that exposure is the wake up call that keeps echoing through boardrooms and living rooms alike as the costs mount and the imbalances become harder to ignore. Women facing their own set of pressures in this new landscape are learning similar lessons about resilience and the importance of mutual value in any potential partnership. And the raw truth is that both sides are navigating uncharted territory where old assumptions no longer hold and new understandings have to be forged one interaction at a time. This extended period of adjustment will test institutions and individuals alike, but the men who found peace in their chosen paths have already demonstrated the kind of adaptability that comes from necessity and self reliance. And that quality is what will define the coming decades as society figures out how to operate with a different balance of participation and independence. The labor market will keep evolving with wages reflecting scarcity in key areas, while alternative economies grow to accommodate those who prefer flexibility. And the overall picture is one of transformation rather than collapse, because human ingenuity finds ways to move forward even when the original blueprint gets redrawn by the people who once followed it without question. The sobering part that ties it all together is the recognition that actions taken over years created this outcome, and only equally thoughtful actions moving forward can steer it toward a more balanced future. But for now, the men who walked away remain content with the peace they secured, and that contentment is the foundation upon which everything else must now build. The housing sector continues adjusting as fewer traditional family formations slow certain types of development, while labor costs in construction keep pushing prices upward, creating a dual pressure that affects affordability for everyone still in the market. And the men living lean in their alternative setups often avoid that cycle entirely by choosing smaller, more manageable living arrangements that align with their income streams and priorities. This creates pockets of stability amid broader volatility, where those who opted out sidestep some of the economic turbulence that hits harder for those relying on dual incomes or single earner models strained by the same shortages. The ripple continues into retirement planning and savings patterns, where men with lower overhead and flexible work maintain stronger personal financial positions compared to those locked into high expense traditional lifestyles. And that difference further reinforces their decision to stay the course rather than return to setups that previously exposed them to greater financial risks. Education at the secondary level is beginning to experiment with more vocational tracks, but the cultural inertia from years of college for all messaging means many parents and students still view trades as secondary options despite the clear earnings potential and job security that outpace many degree holders burdened with loans. And this mismatch between perception and reality keeps the pipeline thinner than it needs to be for the demands ahead. The men who bypass that route entirely by entering gig or digital spaces early have proven that practical skills and self taught knowledge can sustain comfortable lives without the formal credentials that once seemed mandatory, and their success stories quietly challenge the dominant narrative while highlighting the value of adaptability over prescribed paths. This is the kind of ground level shift that does not make headlines, but it is reshaping how younger generations view success and stability in ways that will influence labor markets for decades to come. The legal environment surrounding relationships and family matters remains a significant factor in men's hesitation to re engage, because the frameworks that once felt balanced now carry perceptions of imbalance that have been reinforced through countless personal accounts and high profile cases, making the perceived downside outweigh the potential upside for many who have already established independent routines that shield them from those vulnerabilities. The peace they cultivate in solitude includes emotional and financial buffers that traditional commitments often strip away. And that realization keeps them grounded in their choices, even as external voices call for greater involvement. Women who desire partnership in this context must navigate those realities by building trust through actions that demonstrate understanding of the past dynamics rather than expecting automatic buy in. And this evolution, while challenging, represents the only sustainable way forward in a landscape where assumptions have been upended by lived experience on both sides. Broader societal metrics on everything from volunteerism to community involvement show changes as men allocate their time and energy differently, focusing on personal networks and interests that provide fulfillment without the institutional overhead that once consumed large portions of their lives. And this reallocation, while reducing participation in some traditional structures, increases engagement in others that align more closely with their current values and capacities. The raw outcome is a more selective form of contribution that prioritizes quality and autonomy over quantity and obligation, and that selectivity is what gives the overall movement its resilience because it stems from genuine preference rather than coercion or temporary trends. Society that once counted on broad male involvement across sectors is learning to function with more targeted participation, and the adjustment period brings both challenges and opportunities for innovation in how work and life get structured moving forward. The AI driven changes in white collar fields have left many professionals, including large numbers of women, reevaluating their career trajectories, and the sudden obsolescence of certain roles has accelerated conversations about alternative lifestyles that include shared responsibilities and reduced personal financial pressure. Yet the men positioned to offer that stability have often built lives that do not revolve around stepping into provider roles under the previous cultural terms. And this creates a negotiation dynamic that requires patience and mutual adaptation from everyone involved. The sobering truth in these moments is that independence cut both ways, and the freedom men claimed for themselves mirrors the autonomy women sought earlier, but with different outcomes based on how each group responded to the opportunities and risks presented. And understanding that parallel without blame is key to moving beyond the current impasse toward whatever new balance emerges. Infrastructure projects at the national level face ongoing delays and budget overruns precisely because the skilled workforce needed to execute them efficiently remains limited, and the higher wages offered to attract talent only partially solve the problem when the total number of available workers does not expand to match the scope of the ambitions outlined in legislation. This gap between plans and execution highlights the human element that cannot be automated or outsourced indefinitely. And the men who could fill those roles have found more appealing options in their self directed paths, leaving project managers and policymakers to confront the limits of incentives when deeper cultural factors are at play. The authoritative perspective is that real progress requires acknowledging those factors honestly rather than treating the shortage as a simple supply issue, because the supply dried up for reasons that go to the heart of how society values and treats the people who do the building and maintaining. Demographic projections continue to warn of shrinking workforces and rising dependency ratios as birth rates stay low, and the men who have chosen not to pursue family formation contribute to that trend by prioritizing their own peace and stability over the uncertainties of parenthood in the current environment. And this choice, while personal, has collective consequences that will shape public policy and economic planning for generations. The women who desire children and stable partnerships face a market where potential co parents are more selective and less numerous, leading to extended searches and higher standards that reflect the new realities on both sides and the resulting lower family formation rates feedback into the labor and social systems, creating a self reinforcing loop that only breaks with fundamental shifts in trust and incentives. This is the long view that makes the current situation feel so weighty because the decisions being made today by individuals seeking peace and autonomy will echo through population statistics and economic indicators for decades. Local businesses in service and repair sectors adapt by raising prices and extending wait times as they compete for the same limited pool of skilled hands, and customers learn to budget more for maintenance that once felt routine, while the men operating in gig or independent capacities often provide flexible solutions that fill some of the gaps without committing to the full time structures that previously defined those industries. This hybrid approach keeps essential services moving, but it does not restore the efficiency or scale that existed when labor participation was higher and the men who walked away remained content with their contributions on their terms, rather than returning to the old model that no longer feels viable or respectful. The raw reality is that economies evolve when the people powering them change their behaviors, and the current evolution reflects a clear preference for autonomy and balance over the previous patterns of sacrifice and expectation. The cultural conversation is slowly catching up to these ground level changes as more voices from different backgrounds start examining the data and personal accounts that reveal the depth of the shift, and the peace that men have found in their solitude stands as a testament to human adaptability in the face of adversity rather than a problem to be solved through top down interventions. Women navigating their own challenges in this environment are discovering strengths in self reliance while also recognizing the value of partnerships built on equal footing. And the interplay between these experiences is what will define the next chapter as both groups adjust to the new normal without the luxury of returning to outdated assumptions. This ongoing adjustment is not easy, but it is necessary, and the men who led the way by walking away and finding peace have inadvertently forced a reckoning that could lead to more authentic ways of living and working together if the lessons are truly absorbed. The economic data keeps confirming that certain sectors cannot expand without addressing the participation gap, and the men who have successfully built alternative lives demonstrate that fulfillment and contribution can take many forms beyond to the traditional 9 to 5. And that demonstration challenges everyone to rethink what productivity and success really mean in a world where old certainties have dissolved. The sobering wake up call lands differently for each listener, but the core message remains consistent. The choices made by men in response to their environment have created a landscape that demands adaptation from all sides, and the peace they secured is not negotiable on the old terms, which means the future belongs to those who can build bridges based on mutual understanding rather than outdated expectations. This is the reality playing out in real time, and observing it with clear eyes allows for better navigation no matter where you stand in the equation. As these trends settle into the broader culture, the emphasis shifts from panic over shortages to practical strategies for coexistence with a workforce that values independence, and the men who embody that value continue to thrive in their chosen paths, while society learns to operate with the tools and people available rather than wishing for the return of previous patterns that no longer align with current realities. The authoritative but raw truth is that this new equilibrium, while disruptive in some ways, also opens doors to innovation and personal freedom that benefit those willing to embrace the change, and the peace found in solitude serves as a foundation for whatever comes next in this evolving story of adaptation and resilience. The corporate world is scrambling in ways that reveal just how dependent Big operations got on that steady stream of male talent, showing up day after day, because when those skilled hands started thinning out in the trades and technical fields, companies began rethinking everything from their hiring pipelines to their investment strategies. And suddenly you see executives who used to dismiss blue collar paths as outdated, now quietly launching internal programs to fast track apprentices and offer signing bonuses that would have seemed insane a decade ago. Yet, even with the cash on the table, the uptake stays slower than expected, since the men who already built their own lanes are not jumping at the chance to trade flexibility for a corner office or a union card. Boards are pouring resources into automation, not just to boost efficiency, but to hedge against the human factor they can no longer count on. And that push accelerates the very technologies that are reshaping entire industries. While the raw truth sitting there at the bar is that this scramble exposes a vulnerability. No spreadsheet predicted. The system assumed men would keep volunteering for the grind. But when respect and reciprocity dried up, the volunteers walked, and now the suits are left adapting on the fly or watching their timelines slip further into the red. Consumer markets are feeling the shift in quiet but unmistakable patterns, where demand for certain durable goods and repair services slows in some segments because fewer men anchoring traditional households means different spending habits that favor experiences or low maintenance setups over the big ticket family oriented purchases that used to drive economic engines. And retailers who once bet heavily on suburban expansion are now recalibrating their inventories to match a population that is living leaner and more selectively, which ripples straight back into manufacturing forecasts that already face those same labor constraints. The sobering part is watching how entire product categories that relied on steady male driven consumption start to contract, while new niches emerge around tools for self reliance, gig gear, and digital lifestyle products that cater to the independent operators who have carved out their own space. And this evolution is not some temporary blip. It is the market responding to real changes in how people allocate their money and time after years of the old model losing its appeal for half the population. Entrepreneurship is taking on a different flavor altogether, as men who opted out of the corporate track channel their energy into ventures that operate on their own terms, whether that is small scale manufacturing from home workshops or online platforms that connect niche skills with immediate needs. And these grassroots operations often outpace the lumbering giants in agility and customer focus, because they skip the layers of bureaucracy that once bogged down decision making. The authoritative view from the bar is that this wave of self directed business building is quietly rebuilding economic resilience in pockets that the mainstream overlooks, and it challenges the narrative that innovation only happens inside big funded labs or university spin offs, since the real sparks are coming from guys who learn to solve problems without waiting for permission or approval from gatekeepers who no longer hold the keys. Agriculture and food supply chains are confronting their own version of this reality, where the skilled labor needed for everything from equipment maintenance to harvesting operations and processing facilities is harder to secure. And that tightness is pushing costs higher while forcing producers to invest in more robotics or alternative labor sources that come with their own trade offs and limitations. Farms that used to run on experienced crews now deal with seasonal shortages that affect yield and quality, which eventually shows up on grocery shelves in the form of higher prices and less variety. And the men who could have filled those roles are instead managing their own smaller scale projects or gig routes that give them control over when and how they work, rather than tying their livelihood to the unpredictable rhythms of large scale operations. This is the kind of downstream pressure that does not make front page news, but it quietly erodes the stability of food systems that everyone takes for granted until the gaps start widening. And the sobering wake up is realizing how interconnected every sector becomes when one key group steps back and chooses a different path. Military recruitment and readiness are hitting similar headwinds because the pool of physically fit and mechanically inclined young men who once formed the backbone of the forces is smaller and more selective about signing up for service that demands total commitment without the same cultural respect it carried in earlier eras, and the branches are adjusting by offering bigger incentives and rethinking training pipelines. Yet the numbers tell a story of sustained shortfalls that affect everything from technical specialties to basic troop strength. The raw truth here is that the same attitudes that pushed men away from civilian trades have parallels in how the armed services are perceived. And when the message from society at large frames traditional male strengths as problematic, it should come as no surprise that enlistment dips and the people responsible for national defense start sounding alarms that echo the ones coming from corporate boardrooms. Definitions of success are quietly morphing in real time as more men measure their lives by personal autonomy and low stress equilibrium rather than the old markers of titles, corner offices, or family provider status. And this internal recalibration is reshaping everything from career advice passed down to younger guys to the kinds of goals that motivate daily effort. What used to be seen as dropping out now looks more like leveling up to a version of achievement that prioritizes mental clarity, financial independence, and time sovereignty. And the authoritative lens on it is that this evolution is forcing a broader conversation about what actually constitutes a life well lived in an era where the old promises of fulfillment through endless grinding no longer hold water for large numbers of people. Community level dynamics are changing in subtle but lasting ways, where neighborhoods that once revolved around stable male breadwinners and two-parent households now show different patterns of engagement with local events, volunteer efforts, and social networks that reflect the new distribution of time and energy. Men who embrace solitude and self directed paths often contribute through informal channels like coaching youth sports on their schedule or maintaining community infrastructure as side projects rather than through formal organizations. And this decentralized approach keeps certain bonds alive, even as traditional structures lose participants. The sobering observation is that these shifts are not destroying social fabric. They are rewiring it in ways that emphasize voluntary involvement over obligatory participation, and that rewiring carries both challenges and unexpected strengths for the groups willing to adapt to the new rhythm. Innovation itself is splitting along different lines, with male heavy fields like certain engineering and trades related advancements slowing in some areas due to the talent crunch, while parallel tracks in digital tools and personal tech accelerate because the men building them are operating from positions of independence that reward creativity without corporate oversight. The raw reality playing out is that the very scarcity is spurring breakthroughs in automation and remote monitoring that might not have happened as quickly if the old labor supply had remained steady. And this feedback loop where withdrawal drives technological leaps is one of the most underappreciated aspects of the whole story because it shows how human choices can reshape the tools we all use in profound and sometimes ironic ways. Long term projections on social structures paint a picture of smaller, more fluid family and community units where the emphasis falls on individual resilience and chosen networks rather than the expansive, interconnected webs that defined previous generations. And this contraction brings both lighter loads for those involved and heavier responsibilities when support systems are less automatic. Women navigating these changes are finding their own paths toward redefined roles that blend career elements with personal fulfillment. Yet the overall demographic math means slower population replacement and the kinds of societal adjustments that come with aging cohorts and concentrated urban living. The authoritative but raw take is that these projections are not doom and gloom. They are simply the logical endpoint of choices made over decades, and the people who see them clearly are the ones best positioned to navigate the terrain ahead without clinging to outdated blueprints that no longer match the human landscape. Policy failures keep stacking up as lawmakers throw one initiative after another at the symptoms without ever addressing the core erosion of trust that led men to opt out in the first place. And you watch billions get allocated to retraining or incentive packages only to see enrollment lag because the messaging still carries the faint echo of blame rather than genuine respect for the decisions men have made about their own lives. The sobering part is that these top down efforts often end up creating more bureaucracy that further alienates the very people they aim to reach, and the cycle repeats with new reports and new funding announcements that fail to move the participation needle because the fundamental cultural reset required goes much deeper than any single piece of legislation can touch. Shifts in media narratives are starting to reflect a grudging acknowledgement that the old storylines about male disengagement as pure pathology are missing the mark, and more voices are emerging that frame the situation as a rational response to mismatched incentives, though the transition is slow and uneven, with plenty of holdouts still pushing the same tired angles that got us here. The raw truth filtering through the noise is that when the conversation finally catches up to the ground level reality, it opens space for more honest dialogue about what mutual respect actually looks like in practice rather than in theory. And that dialogue is where any meaningful course correction would have to begin. If the goal is a society that functions with willing participation from everyone involved. Parallel economies are solidifying as men who walked away build out their own ecosystems of exchange that operate alongside the mainstream without depending on it for validation or survival. And these networks range from local skill sharing groups to digital marketplaces that reward competence over credentials, and they thrive precisely because they cut out the middle layers that once extracted value without delivering proportional respect. The authoritative observation is that this parallel track is not competition in the destructive sense. It is diversification that adds resilience to the overall system, and the men operating within it are demonstrating that self organized structures can deliver results that rigid institutions struggle to match, especially when those institutions have lost the goodwill of the people who once powered them. Consumer behavior continues evolving toward preferences that favor durability, flexibility, and personal control, with purchases leaning into items that support independent living rather than the consumption patterns that assumed stable dual income households. And this pivot is forcing brands to rethink their marketing and product development in ways that acknowledge the new demographics without ever saying it outright. The sobering wake up call lands when you realize how deeply these preference changes are embedded in the daily decisions people make about where to spend their money and time. And the companies that adapt fastest are the ones that will survive the transition, while those clinging to the old model watch their market share erode one quiet choice at a time. Technology is enabling a level of independence that previous generations could only dream about, with tools for remote work skill, acquisition, and financial management, putting real power in the hands of individuals who choose to operate outside traditional frameworks. And the men who embrace these tools early are now reaping the benefits of systems that reward initiative and adaptability over conformity and tenure. This tech enabled autonomy is what gives the current equilibrium its staying power, because it lowers the barriers to self reliance and raises the bar for any institution that wants to compete for attention and loyalty. And the raw reality is that once people taste that level of control, they become far less likely to trade it back for structures that previously treated them as interchangeable parts. Fertility patterns and population dynamics are locked into a trajectory that will define the next half century, with lower birth rates, creating smaller cohorts entering adulthood, and the resulting strain on everything from pension systems to innovation pipelines becomes more pronounced as the math of dependency ratios shifts in ways that no amount of immigration or policy tweaking can fully offset without addressing the underlying reluctance to form families in the first place. The authoritative view is that these numbers are not abstract. They represent real human choices accumulated over time. And the sobering part is watching how the peace men found in their independence contributes to a broader societal contraction that forces everyone to confront the long game consequences of short term cultural priorities that once seemed liberating but now reveal their limits in the cold light of demographic reality. Social structures at every level are recalibrating around smaller voluntary units where loyalty is earned daily rather than assumed through tradition. And this recalibration brings a certain lightness to daily life for those who opt in while creating voids in areas that once relied on automatic participation from large numbers of men. The raw truth is that these changes are neither good nor bad. In some absolute sense, they are simply the outcome of people responding to the environment they were given, and the ones who thrive are those who accept the new map instead of spending energy wishing for the old territory to return unchanged. Corporate adaptations are moving beyond surface level perks into deeper structural changes like flatter hierarchies, remote options, and skill based advancement that attempt to recapture some of the flexibility men have come to expect in their independent paths. And yet the uptake remains uneven because the lingering cultural baggage makes many guys wary of any arrangement that could once again shift the risk reward balance against them. The sobering observation is that genuine adaptation requires more than policy tweaks. It demands a fundamental shift in how competence and contribution are valued without the overlay of suspicion or entitlement that poison the previous setup. And until that shift happens, the parallel economies will continue to draw talent away from the center. Automation acceleration is not just a response to labor gaps, it is becoming the default strategy for maintaining output in fields that can no longer count on human scaling. And this race toward machines is reshaping job descriptions across sectors in ways that favor oversight and programming skills over the hands on expertise that defined earlier eras. The authoritative but raw take is that this technological leap is both a symptom and a cause of the current situation because it reduces the need for certain types of labor while simultaneously highlighting the irreplaceable value of the human judgment that still guides the systems, and the men who position themselves as independent operators are often the ones best placed to ride this wave rather than being swept aside by it. Shifts in entrepreneurship culture are emphasizing bootstrap models and micro enterprises that scale through networks of trust rather than massive capital raises. And this bottom up approach aligns perfectly with the mindset of men who value control and low overhead over the glamour of venture backed growth that comes with strings attached. The result is a quieter but more sustainable form of economic activity that builds wealth in smaller increments and spreads it across more participants, which stands in contrast to the concentrated gains that characterized earlier boom periods. And the sobering truth is that this distributed model may prove more resilient in the long run precisely because it does not depend on the constant influx of traditional labor that society can no longer guarantee. Impacts on agriculture run deeper than seasonal labor. because the maintenance of complex machinery and irrigation systems requires consistent skilled attention that is now spread thinner, and producers are turning to data driven precision techniques to compensate. Yet those techniques still need human operators who understand both the tech and the land. The raw reality is that food security in an era of tightening labor pools depends on innovation, that the men operating outside the system are often pioneering on their own small plots or through consulting gigs that bring fresh perspectives to age old problems. And this cross pollination is one of the unexpected benefits of the broader withdrawal that no central planner could have engineered. Military recruitment challenges extend beyond numbers to the quality of candidates who bring mechanical aptitude and problem solving under pressure. And the forces are adapting by expanding outreach into non traditional pools while offering pathways that respect the independence many young men now expect. The authoritative lens shows that sustained shortfalls here carry strategic implications for readiness and deterrence, because a force that cannot attract the right talent in key technical roles risks falling behind adversaries who face fewer cultural barriers to mobilizing their own manpower. And the sobering wake up is that national security is not immune to the domestic cultural currents that reshape civilian life. Evolving definitions of success are filtering into everyday conversations where fulfillment is measured by personal metrics like time freedom, financial buffers, and mental peace rather than external validation through status or provision. And this cultural pivot is empowering a generation to pursue paths that feel authentic, even if they look unconventional to older eyes. The raw truth is that when enough people adopt these new metrics, the entire incentive structure of society begins to tilt. And institutions that want to remain relevant have to speak the language of autonomy and respect rather than duty and sacrifice if they hope to regain any meaningful engagement. Community level changes are manifesting in everything from local event attendance to informal support networks where men contribute on their terms through skills, workshops, or maintenance projects that keep neighborhoods functional without requiring formal membership or long term commitments. The sobering part is recognizing that these voluntary contributions often deliver more consistent value than the obligatory systems they replaced because they are driven by genuine interest rather than social pressure. And this voluntary model is what gives the new social fabric its unexpected durability, even as traditional structures continue to thin out. Innovation in sectors traditionally dominated by male labor is slowing in pace for certain foundational technologies while exploding in adjacent fields, where independent operators can experiment without institutional gatekeeping. And this divergence is creating a landscape where the most exciting breakthroughs often come from the edges rather than the center. The authoritative view is that this edge based innovation is the natural outcome of talent flowing toward environments that reward risk and creativity. And the long term effect is a more decentralized progress engine that may ultimately prove harder to disrupt than the concentrated models of the past. Long term projections on social structures point toward a world of more intentional relationships and chosen families where the emphasis is on compatibility and mutual benefit rather than default roles. And this intentionality, while reducing overall numbers, is raising the quality of the connections that do form. The raw reality is that societies have survived similar demographic adjustments throughout history by adapting their expectations and support systems. And the current transition is no different once people stop fighting the data and start building on the new foundations that men have quietly laid through their choices. Policy landscapes continue to evolve with mixed results as some jurisdictions experiment with cultural messaging campaigns that attempt to restore respect for practical skills, while others double down on incentives that treat the participation gap as a simple economic equation. And the ones showing the most promise are those that focus on removing barriers rather than adding new layers of oversight. The sobering observation is that meaningful policy impact requires humility about the limits of government reach, because the men who walked away did so after weighing personal costs and benefits, and no amount of external pressure will override that internal calculation unless the underlying environment changes in ways they can see and trust. Media responses are gradually incorporating more balanced perspectives that acknowledge the agency and rationality behind male choices rather than framing them solely as crisis or failure. And this shift in tone is helping to normalize the conversation in ways that could eventually reduce stigma around alternative paths. The authoritative but raw truth is that when the public narrative catches up to the lived reality, it creates space for genuine solutions instead of endless hand wringing. And the people paying attention to that evolution are the ones who will navigate the coming decades with clearer eyes and fewer illusions about how societies actually function when half the population rewrites the rules on its own terms. Parallel economies are maturing into robust alternatives that handle everything from skill certification to dispute resolution through reputation systems and voluntary associations. And this self contained infrastructure is what allows men to thrive without needing approval from the mainstream institutions they left behind. The sobering wake up is realizing how quickly these parallel systems can scale when motivated by genuine need, and the long term implication is a more pluralistic economic landscape where different models coexist and compete based on results rather than mandates. Consumer markets are segmenting further into niches that cater to independent lifestyles with products designed for portability, modularity, and low maintenance, which in turn influences supply chains to become more agile and less reliant on massive fixed labor forces. The raw reality is that this segmentation is not a loss, it is an adaptation that reflects real changes in how people live and spend, and the brands that read the room correctly are the ones building loyalty with the very demographic that once seemed like a given, but is now a deliberate choice. Technology enabling independence continues to advance with better tools for everything from remote diagnostics to automated small scale production. And the men who adopted these early are positioned to lead the next wave of decentralized manufacturing and service delivery that bypasses the bottlenecks still plaguing larger operations. The authoritative take is that this tech driven autonomy is the secret sauce keeping the new equilibrium stable, because it turns potential isolation into connected self reliance. And that connection without dependence is what makes the whole phenomenon so durable across generations. Fertility and population dynamics are not just numbers on a chart. They represent the cumulative effect of millions of individual decisions about partnership and family in an environment where the perceived risks for men have outweighed the rewards, and the resulting slower growth forces societies to innovate in elder care, productivity, and immigration policy in ways that would have been unnecessary under the old demographic assumptions. The sobering truth is that these trends are self reinforcing until the cultural and legal environments shift enough to restore confidence on all sides. And until then, the projections remain a steady downward slope that reshapes everything from school sizes to retirement ages. Social structures are becoming more modular, with people assembling support networks based on shared values and practical reciprocity rather than geographic or traditional ties. And this modularity brings flexibility, but also requires more active maintenance than the automatic bonds of the past. The raw observation is that this modular approach mirrors the independence men have cultivated, and it is spreading as others see the benefits of relationships that can be adjusted without catastrophic fallout, which in turn normalizes the very choices that started the larger shift. Corporate adaptations that stick are the ones that genuinely flatten power dynamics and reward results over tenure, because those changes speak directly to the values men have demonstrated by walking away. And anything less is seen as window dressing that fails to address the trust deficit built up over years. The authoritative but raw perspective is that real corporate evolution happens when leadership stops treating talent as an endless resource and starts competing for it on terms of respect, flexibility, and fairness, which is exactly what the parallel economies already offer without the overhead. Automation is not stopping at the factory floor, it is moving into service and knowledge work at a pace that surprises even the experts, and this broad sweep is forcing a reevaluation of what human labor actually means in an economy where machines can handle routine tasks faster and cheaper than people ever could. The sobering part is that this acceleration was partly triggered by the very labor shortages we are discussing, and now it is feeding back into the system, creating new opportunities for those who can design, maintain, and direct the machines while leaving routine roles behind. Entrepreneurship in the new landscape favors models that scale through networks of independent operators rather than hierarchical corporations, and this networked approach is proving more resilient to economic swings because it distributes risk and reward in ways that align with the autonomy men have come to expect. The raw truth is that these models are quietly rewriting the rules of business ownership, and the people building them are the same ones who opted out of the old system and found better ways to create value on their own terms. Agriculture is seeing a quiet renaissance in small scale and tech enabled operations where individual operators use data and automation to achieve yields that rival larger farms with far less labor overhead. And this shift is driven by the same men who chose independence over traditional employment and are now applying their skills in ways that enhance food production without relying on the strained supply of seasonal workers. The authoritative view is that this bottom up innovation may be the key to long term food security in a world where large scale labor is no longer guaranteed. Military readiness depends on attracting men who bring both physical capability and technical aptitude, and the current environment makes that recruitment more competitive than ever because the same independence that keeps men out of civilian trades also makes them selective about military service unless the offer includes genuine respect and clear pathways to personal growth. The sobering reality is that strategic advantages are built on human capital. And when that capital becomes more selective, the entire defense posture has to adjust accordingly or risk falling behind. Definitions of success continue to diversify as personal fulfillment metrics gain ground over traditional status symbols. And this diversification is empowering people to pursue lives that feel authentic rather than performative, which in turn reduces the social pressure that once kept everyone marching in the same direction. The raw observation is that when success becomes subjective, the old one size fits all narratives lose their power and society fragments into more varied and resilient subcultures that each define their own terms for a life well lived. Community engagement is becoming more project based and less institutionally tied, with men contributing through short term, high impact efforts that fit their schedules and interests rather than lifelong memberships. And this project based model keeps social capital flowing even as formal organizations see declining participation. The sobering truth is that voluntary engagement often proves more sustainable than mandatory involvement because it is rooted in genuine motivation rather than guilt or tradition. Innovation ecosystems are decentralizing further with makerspaces, online collaborations, and small team ventures producing breakthroughs that challenge the dominance of large research institutions. And the men driving this decentralization are the same ones who walked away from traditional paths and found better ways to solve problems without waiting for approval from above. The authoritative take is that this decentralization is the natural evolution of talent flowing toward environments that value speed and autonomy over process and hierarchy. Long term social projections point toward a world where smaller chosen families and intentional communities replace the expansive traditional structures. And this contraction, while reducing overall population growth, creates tighter, more meaningful bonds that may prove stronger in times of stress than the looser connections of the past. The raw reality is that societies have always adapted to demographic shifts by redefining what family and community mean, and the current transition is simply the latest chapter in that ongoing story. Policy experiments that focus on cultural restoration rather than financial bribes are starting to show modest results in pockets where respect for practical skills is genuinely elevated, and these successes offer a roadmap for broader change if leaders are willing to learn from what actually moves the needle instead of doubling down on approaches that have already failed. The sobering observation is that policy works best when it aligns with human nature rather than trying to override it. And the men who walked away have demonstrated through their choices exactly what that nature looks like when given real freedom. Media narratives that embrace nuance are gaining traction because audiences are hungry for explanations that match their lived experience rather than the simplified crisis stories that dominated earlier coverage. And this audience pull is forcing more outlets to explore the rational side of male independence without pathologizing it. The authoritative but raw truth is that when the storytellers finally catch up to the street level reality, the public conversation can move from blame to understanding, and that understanding is the only foundation on which lasting solutions can be built. Parallel economies are expanding their reach into new sectors as the tools for self organization become more sophisticated, and the men operating within them are creating value chains that are more responsive and less fragile than the centralized models they left behind. The sobering wake up is that these economies are not temporary, they are the new baseline for a growing segment of the population. And the mainstream will either learn to coexist with them or continue losing ground one independent operator at a time. Consumer markets are fragmenting into even more specialized segments that reward brands capable of speaking directly to the values of autonomy and practicality. And this fragmentation is accelerating the decline of mass market giants while lifting up nimble players who understand the new demographics. The raw reality is that consumer choice is one of the most powerful forces reshaping the economy. And when millions of men vote with their wallets for independence, the entire market landscape tilts in response. Technology continues to lower the barriers to self reliance with advances in affordable manufacturing tools, energy storage, and communication platforms that put professional grade capabilities into the hands of individuals, and the men who embrace these tools early are now leading the charge in decentralized production and service models that challenge the old economies of scale. The authoritative view is that this tech democratization is the ultimate enabler of the current equilibrium because it makes independence not just possible, but preferable for those who value control over convenience. Fertility dynamics are intertwined with economic and cultural signals in ways that make reversal difficult without addressing the root causes of hesitation around family formation. And the resulting population slowdown is forcing societies to confront questions of sustainability that were once theoretical but are now immediate. The sobering truth is that demographics are destiny, and the choices being made today will shape the size and composition of societies for the next century in ways that no short term policy can fully counteract. Social structures are becoming more adaptive and less prescriptive, with people assembling the support systems that work for their individual circumstances rather than fitting themselves into predetermined roles. And this adaptability is what gives the new normal its surprising resilience. The raw observation is that when structures serve people instead of the other way around, they tend to last longer and function better, which is exactly what the men who walked away have demonstrated through their daily choices. Corporate adaptations that succeed are those that treat talent as partners rather than resources, and the ones that get it right are seeing gradual returns in engagement from the very demographic that once seemed permanently disengaged. The authoritative but raw perspective is that respect is not a cost, it is an investment. And the companies that finally internalize that lesson will be the ones positioned to thrive in the new labor landscape. Automation is reshaping entire value chains from raw materials to end user delivery. And this comprehensive transformation is creating new categories of work, even as it displaces old ones in ways that reward the kind of independent problem solving men have honed in their self directed paths. The sobering part is that the pace of this change is only accelerating, and the societies that adapt their education and cultural messaging to prepare people for it will fare far better than those still clinging to outdated assumptions about lifetime careers in single industries. Entrepreneurship is flourishing in the spaces between traditional sectors where men are combining skills from multiple disciplines to create hybrid businesses that solve problems the big players overlooked. And this hybrid approach is proving more innovative and customer focused than the specialized but rigid models of the past. The raw truth is that necessity truly is the mother of invention, and the necessity created by walking away has sparked a wave of creative problem solving that is quietly rebuilding economic vitality from the ground up. Agriculture is benefiting from the same independent spirit that drives other sectors as small operators experiment with regenerative techniques and tech integrations that improve yields while reducing labor demands. And this experimentation is laying the groundwork for more sustainable food systems that do not depend on the large crews of the past. The authoritative view is that these bottom up solutions may prove more scalable in the long run than top down mandates because they are rooted in practical experience rather than theoretical planning. And military recruitment is evolving toward more specialized and tech integrated roles that appeal to the independent mindset while still maintaining the core values of service. And the branches that succeed in this evolution will be the ones that respect the autonomy and competence of the men they seek to attract. The sobering reality is that defense capabilities depend on human commitment. And when that commitment becomes more selective, the entire strategic equation changes in ways that demand honest adaptation rather than wishful thinking. Definitions of success are now as varied as the men defining them, with some prioritizing financial independence, others focusing on skill mastery, and still others valuing time freedom above all. And this variety is creating a richer tapestry of human achievement than the narrow metrics of previous eras. The raw observation is that when people are free to define their own success, the overall level of satisfaction tends to rise, even if the aggregate economic statistics look different. And that satisfaction is what ultimately sustains societies through periods of transition. Community engagement is thriving in informal channels where men share knowledge and resources through networks that operate on mutual benefit rather than formal hierarchy. And this informal thriving is keeping social capital alive in ways that formal institutions sometimes struggle to match. The sobering truth is that human connection finds a way even when traditional structures weaken, because the need for it is hardwired, and the new forms it takes are often more authentic than the old ones ever were. Innovation is becoming more democratized as tools for creation and collaboration become accessible to anyone with drive. And the men who lead this democratization are the same ones who chose independence and now use that independence to push boundaries in fields ranging from software to hardware to systems design. The authoritative take is that this democratization is the natural outcome of talent being freed from institutional constraints, and the breakthroughs that result will define the next era of progress. Long term social projections suggest a world where intentional living and chosen obligations replace the automatic roles of the past. And this shift, while reducing scale, is increasing depth and meaning in the relationships and communities that remain. The raw reality is that societies have always reinvented themselves in response to changing human priorities, and the current reinvention is simply the latest chapter in that eternal process. Policy experiments that emphasize cultural respect and practical opportunity are the ones showing the most promise because they align with the values men have demonstrated through their choices. And these experiments offer hope that broader change is possible when leaders listen rather than lecture. The sobering observation is that policy is most effective when it works with human nature instead of against it. And the men who walked away have given us a clear map of what that nature looks like when left to its own devices. Media narratives that prioritize understanding over judgment are helping to bridge the gap between different perspectives, and this bridge is essential for any meaningful dialogue about the future, because without it, the conversation stays stuck in blame and denial. The authoritative but raw truth is that honest storytelling has always been the first step toward collective adaptation. And the current crop of voices willing to tell the unvarnished story are the ones moving the culture forward, one conversation at a time. Parallel economies are becoming more sophisticated with their own standards of excellence and systems of accountability that rival anything the mainstream offers, and the men building them are proving that self organization can achieve scale and reliability without central control. The sobering wake up is that these economies are here to stay. And the question is no longer whether they will persist, but how the larger society will integrate with them in ways that benefit everyone involved. Consumer markets are responding to the new realities by offering more options for modular living, flexible work support, and skill development. And this response is creating a feedback loop where supply meets demand in increasingly precise ways that reward the independent operators driving the change. The raw reality is that markets are conversations between people and their choices. And when millions choose independence, the market listens and adapts faster than any central authority ever could. Technology is continuing to empower individuals with capabilities that once required entire departments, and the men who harness these capabilities are creating value at a scale and speed that challenges the old assumptions about what is possible outside traditional structures. The authoritative view is that this empowerment is the cornerstone of the new equilibrium because it makes self reliance not just viable, but superior for those who value freedom over security. Fertility dynamics remain a critical variable in the long term equation because they determine the size of the future workforce and consumer base. And the current patterns suggest a world that will look very different from the one previous generations took for granted. The sobering truth is that these patterns are the direct result of individual calculations about risk and reward, and altering them requires changing the underlying conditions that shape those calculations. Social structures are adapting by becoming more flexible and less prescriptive, which allows people to find the configurations that work best for their unique circumstances. And this flexibility is what keeps the social fabric intact, even as its weave changes. The raw observation is that human societies have always evolved in response to the priorities of their members, and the current evolution is simply reflecting the priorities of a generation that values autonomy and authenticity above conformity and obligation. The entire landscape is still unfolding in real time, with each new data point and personal choice adding another layer to the story of how a society responds when half its population decides to rewrite the rules on its own terms, and the men who made that decision are living proof that sometimes the most powerful force for change is the quiet decision to walk away and build something better in the space that opens up. The sobering wake up call that ties it all together is that this is not a temporary phase. It is a fundamental realignment. And the people who grasp that reality now are the ones who will shape the next chapter rather than being surprised by it when it arrives. The way this plays out in everyday life for the men who made that choice shows up in how they structure their days around what actually energizes them rather than what society once demanded. And you see guys waking up without an alarm clock, tackling projects that match their natural rhythms. Whether that is fine tuning a home workshop or diving deep into learning a new digital skill that pays the bills on their schedule. And this kind of self paced existence reveals a level of personal agency that the old corporate ladder never delivered, because back then every hour was accounted for by someone else, and the constant pressure to perform for approval left little room for genuine curiosity or recovery. And now, with that pressure lifted, many discover talents and interests they never had time to explore, leading to side ventures that grow organically into reliable income without the burnout that used to define the standard work week. The energy sector feels this transformation in ways that hit the grid itself, because maintaining power plants, pipelines, and renewable installations requires the same kind of skilled hands that have grown scarce in other trades. And when those crews shrink, the reliability of supply starts to waver, with longer response times for repairs and higher costs passed straight to households and businesses that depend on steady electricity for everything from hospitals to data centers. And the men who could have kept things humming are instead managing their own smaller scale energy setups like solar arrays for personal use or consulting gigs that let them pick projects aligned with their expertise rather than tying themselves to massive utility companies that once took their labor for granted. And this shift forces the industry to accelerate investments in smarter monitoring systems and automated diagnostics. Yet those technologies still need human oversight from people who understand both the hardware and the real world variables that algorithms cannot predict. Logistics and supply chains are undergoing their own quiet overhaul as the shortage of experienced drivers, mechanics, and warehouse coordinators leads to bottlenecks that slow down the movement of goods from ports to store shelves, and you watch delivery windows stretch out while shipping rates climb because the pool of reliable operators has contracted, and the guys who walked away from those routes found better balance in gig platforms that let them choose loads based on pay and location, or even pivoted into local delivery networks that keep them closer to home without the long haul burnout. And this decentralization of logistics creates more resilient, smaller loops that are less vulnerable to big disruptions. But it also means the old just in time model that kept inventories lean is giving way to something more buffered and expensive, which ripples into higher prices for everyday items and forces retailers to rethink their entire distribution strategy in real time. Young boys growing up in this environment are absorbing a different set of signals about what manhood looks like, because they see fathers, uncles, and older brothers building lives on their own terms with visible satisfaction. And that modeling steers them away from the pressured paths of endless credentialing toward hands on learning and practical problem solving that feels immediate and rewarding, and schools that try to counter this by doubling down on traditional academics find themselves losing engagement, while vocational programs that finally adapt to include real world apprenticeships start seeing renewed interest. Though the cultural lag means many kids still navigate mixed messages from media and educators who have not fully caught up to the new reality on the ground. Cultural perceptions of masculinity are shifting in subtle but profound directions as the old stereotypes of the stoic provider get replaced by images of self reliant individuals who prioritize mental clarity and boundary setting over endless sacrifice. And this evolution challenges everyone to reconsider what strength actually means when it is no longer tied to external validation or societal approval. And the raw truth is that this redefinition is happening organically through the choices men are making daily rather than through any top down campaign. And it leaves a vacuum in the old narratives that once filled magazines and television screens with expectations that no longer match the lived experience of a generation that has tasted genuine autonomy. Women confronting their financial realities in the wake of artificial intelligence reshaping office work often find themselves in positions where the promised career ladder has shortened dramatically and debt from education and living expenses looms larger when the safety net of dual income assumptions no longer holds. And this prompts a hard look at long term planning, where the desire for stability and shared responsibilities resurfaces, but the available partners have already invested in their own self contained systems that do not automatically include stepping back into provider roles under the old cultural terms. The flipped narrative around loneliness starts to clarify when you look at the data and personal accounts showing that many men report higher contentment in their chosen solitude, while the pressures of economic uncertainty and shifting relationship expectations weigh heavier on the other side. And this inversion challenges the common framing by revealing that peace can be found in independence when the alternative feels like carrying disproportionate risk without commensurate reward. And the sobering wake up is recognizing that these emotional landscapes are shaped by real incentives rather than abstract feelings. And until those incentives realign, the patterns will persist regardless of how loudly the alarms get sounded. Long term societal restructuring is already visible in how cities and towns adapt their planning to smaller household sizes and more flexible work arrangements, with zoning changes that favor mixed use developments and co living options that match the new demographics. And the men who built their lives around lean living and digital income streams often thrive in these environments because they require less overhead and allow for the kind of mobility that keeps options open. And this restructuring forces public services from transportation to healthcare to recalibrate their models around a population that participates differently and values self sufficiency over centralized support. Daily routines in this new equilibrium emphasize recovery and deliberate practice, where men allocate time for physical maintenance, skill sharpening, and reflective downtime that the old grind rarely permitted. And this emphasis on sustainability over sprinting creates a foundation of resilience that shows up in lower stress levels and clearer decision making when challenges arise. And the authoritative view is that this deliberate pacing is what allows them to sustain their independence over decades, rather than burning out in pursuit of someone else's definition of success. The human element remains irreplaceable in overseeing complex systems where judgment and adaptability trump pure code, and that reality forces the entire transportation sector to invest in hybrid models that pair machines with the kind of experienced operators who understand the unpredictable variables of weather, traffic, and mechanical quirks that no algorithm fully captures. Yet the men who once filled those roles have already found their stride in more localized, flexible arrangements that let them contribute without surrendering their autonomy. And this hybrid future means the industry will run leaner and smarter, but only after accepting that the old reliance on endless shifts and rigid schedules is gone for good. Because those schedules no longer align with the choices men are making about how they spend their energy and time. What ties all these threads together is the recognition that this is not a reversible trend driven by temporary economics or fleeting moods, but a permanent cultural realignment where men have quietly redrawn the boundaries of their participation based on decades of lived experience that taught them the old contract no longer delivered fairness or respect, and the peace they discovered in solitude and self directed paths has become the new foundation for their lives, a foundation built on clarity, low overhead, and the freedom to say no when the terms do not measure up, and society that once counted on their automatic buy in is now learning the hard way that consent withdrawn is not easily reclaimed without addressing the root causes that prompted the exit in the first place. The sobering truth that lands heaviest when you sit with it long enough is that every major system, from energy grids to supply chains to demographic forecasts, now carries the imprint of that withdrawal, and the ripple effects will continue compounding as smaller generations enter adulthood with different expectations, shaped by watching their elders choose independence over obligation. And this creates a future where institutions must compete for engagement rather than assume it, where respect becomes the currency that actually buys loyalty, and where the old narratives about duty and sacrifice ring hollow unless they are rebuilt on mutual value that men can see and feel in real time. Women navigating their own evolving realities in this landscape are discovering that the independence they fought for comes with its own set of practical limits when the broader support structures shift. And the men available for partnership bring higher standards forged in the fire of self reliance, which means any meaningful reconnection will require genuine demonstration of reciprocity rather than expectations rooted in earlier cultural assumptions. And that adjustment, while challenging for some, is the only path forward in a world where both sides have tasted different versions of autonomy and learned what they are willing to trade for connection. The raw authoritative view from the bar stool is that this entire transformation represents a wake up call that society cannot afford to sleep through any longer, because the men who walked away did so after careful calculation, and the peace they secured is not fragile or temporary. It is the outcome of rational choices in response to an environment that stopped valuing their contributions on equal terms. And now the consequences are visible in every sector that depended on their previous patterns, from infrastructure delays to changing family formation rates to the quiet economic adjustments happening in homes and businesses across the country, and pretending otherwise only delays the necessary reckoning that could lead to a more balanced future if honesty replaces denial. The 1 hour gang, you made it all the way through. And that tells me you are the kind of person who does not shy away from the hard truths, even when they challenge the stories we have all been told for years. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show some real support, you can buy me a Red Bull with a one-time gift or set up a monthly pledge using the link in the description of the video. It keeps the conversations raw and unfiltered so we can keep digging into these realities without any outside pressure. And tell me in the comments what you think about everything we laid out here, whether you agree with the way the pieces fit together or if you see angles I might have missed, because these discussions only get stronger when real people share their honest takes and your thoughts matter in figuring out where this shift is headed next. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.